Good evening, everyone. I'm Sister Ann Norman with Sunnybrook's Board of Directors, and I'm very happy to be here this evening to welcome you to this Speaker Series event. This is our last lecture of the spring season. As is done every year, our talks will resume again in September. We are currently working on the dates and topics and hope you'll be able to join us. More details will be available soon on the Sunnybrook website. If you haven't already, you can sign up to receive notifications by joining our mailing list. And now, to turn our focus to tonight's topic, it is really one that affects all of us: food. There are no shortage of headlines and opinions when it comes to the best diets and meal plans. Do you go high protein or fat-free? Low carb or keto? The list is seemingly endless. To add to this, Canada's Food Guide has recently received a major update. It can be hard to figure out what's best for you and your family. Tonight, you'll learn about the latest guidelines and best tips to work into your life. Interestingly, eating well isn't just about what's on your plate. We have an incredible panel of experts here tonight, and before we hear from them, I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Caitlin Manitis. Caitlin is a registered dietitian and the professional and educational leader of clinical nutrition here at Sunnybrook. She leads the advancement of clinical nutrition within an interprofessional context to support the highest quality of patient care. Caitlin is actively involved in research, education, best practice, and quality improvement initiatives, and holds memberships to various nutrition and health-related organizations. Collaboration with patients, residents, families, caregivers, and other health professionals is central to nutrition practice at Sunnybrook. Together, nutrition is managed for health promotion, disease prevention, and the treatment of acute and chronic diseases. Please help me in giving Caitlin a warm welcome this evening.
Thank you so much, Sister Ann, and good evening to everyone joining us here at the Bayview campus and also watching the webcast at home. Our lecture tonight is called Hungry for Answers, Nutrition Advice Everyone Can Use. We know from the work that we do here at Sunnybrook every day that people are always looking for information on what and when to eat. And we're so excited to have the perfect panel tonight helping us answer these questions. Marcia Felt will start things off with an overview of Canada's new food guide. Jill Zweig will then talk about diets in the headlines and how to make sense of them all. And finally, we'll hear from Annie Huang about the impactful tips and tricks to use at mealtime. We'll set some time aside at the end of all three lectures for a question and answer period. Now, for this question and answer session, you'll find a blank white card on each chair. And so if you have a question, just write your question on that blank card. And between each speaker, there'll be a volunteer coming around to collect those question cards. Just raise your hand or raise the card in the air and someone will come by. Now, we won't have any formal breaks during the session, so feel free to get up anytime that you need. There are washrooms just outside of the auditorium and refreshments in the foyer. So we'll kick things off with our lectures to start, and I'll introduce Marcia first. So Marcia is a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator with our Sunnybrook Academic Family Health team. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome as she tells us and presents about what we all need to know about Canada's new food guide.
Hi, thank you. The food guides are education tools that are designed to help people follow a healthy diet. So why the food guide matters to Canadians? It's integrated widely in the government and stakeholders into nutrition policies and programs and resources. Okay. It's taught in schools and promoted by health professionals when supporting Canadians to eat well. It also can help influence the foods served and sold, served and sold in Canada's public institutions, and as well for foods that Canadians choose themselves for them and their families. So my objectives tonight are to describe the history and the revision process of the Canada's Food Guide, and to summarize the changes to the guide and describe the three guiding principles. The first food guide was developed in 1942. It was called the Official Food Rules, and it was there to improve the Canadians' health at a time of war, when there was wartime rationing, poor access to food, insufficient money, and malnutrition. There were 6 food groups, and each group had a daily amount, and that would meet just 70% of the dietary intake. The Canada Nutrition Program handled the public education campaign and delivered the message to Canadians in magazines, radios, in the news, in the schools, and even in pay envelopes. Here are all the variety of the various guides that have been revised over the past 77 years. All of these guides would have been part of school curriculums. And if you attended school in Canada, you might even recognize a few of these revised versions. I'll just go through a bit of the history, highlighting a few. The food rules name changed in the 1960s to Canada's Food Guide, and they added in more color and metric. And then in 1992, there was a landmark study by the Diet and Cardiovascular Disease Committee that submitted to Health Canada, saying that there needs to be an action on chronic disease. And that's when the guide added in moderation to limit fat, sugar, salt, and alcohol. And then in 1992, the guide changed again and was revised into the rainbow. And the rainbow had the foods that you were to have more of at the larger part of the rainbow. So that was the thicker band. And you could take a higher energy. If someone needed higher amounts of servings, then they could choose more from that group. And it was available on the internet. And then in 2007, it was revised again and updated using the dietary reference intakes. And because of the rising chronic disease and that being associated with food choice, they changed the rainbow so that the fruits and vegetables were in the larger part of the rainbow because of its important role in healthy eating patterns. There was also guidance on the quality of the food choices to help reduce risk and also obesity. And they looked at the different types of fats, and it was encouraged to replace the saturated fat with unsaturated fat, and also to supplement vitamin D in people over 50. It encouraged physical activity. It tailored the guide to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. It also added a greater variety of ethnically diverse foods. It was web-based, and there was guidance on the food label, as well as it was translated into 10 languages. So why revise? So the revision now in 2019 was a multi-year project, and it's part of the healthy eating strategy that was developed in 2016 by the government, that we want to improve the food environment in Canada and make it easier for Canadians to make healthy food choices. And that would be by improving the healthy information available. So the goal was to strengthen the healthy eating recommendations and communicate the guidance in better way to meet the needs of the different users, such as the general public, policymakers, and healthcare professionals. So I want to talk about how the guide was built on these consultations with stakeholders and Canadians. So to help communicate the guidance accurately, they targeted consultations with academics, Indigenous experts and organizations, provincial and territorial governments, healthcare professionals, health charities, and they had open consultations to look at the needs and the expectations for the revised guide. And there were actually close to 20,000 submissions that were made in these consultations. There were focus groups that were held to learn how to use the healthy eating information, and also other feedback that was proposed just to look at the general healthy eating recommendations and how that fit with Canadians and stakeholders, as well as extensive focus group testing with Canadians and healthcare professionals also to develop the tools and the resources that would be communicated, how to communicate the food guide. There were no meetings with representatives from the food and beverage industry in these consultations. There is a document on the Canada Food Guide website on transparency with the stakeholder communication if you're interested to learn more about that. So the revision process also was built on the best available evidence using this evidence review cycle for dietary guidance. So there were three key input areas. There was the scientific basis, which used high quality scientific reports on food and health nutrient standards, as well as included systematic review on over 100 food related topics with convincing conclusions. There was also input from the Canadian content. So from health status, they uncovered that Canadians need to improve the quality of their diet. It's low in vegetable, fruit, milk, and whole grains. Only 16% were meeting the recommended amounts. And it was noticed that a third of the calories were coming from higher fat, sugar, and salt, foods higher in fat, sugar, and salt. And also they used existing guidance to look at the awareness and acceptance and the use by consumers. And they uncovered that the challenges with the other guides was the classification of the foods, the serving sizes, and how to translate that into meals and snacks, and how to make menus from that. And as well, there was this perception that the food industry exerted an influence on the development of the recommendations. So all of this was pulled together and brought into the latest guide, which I'm going to talk about next. And this evidence review cycle, they're going to continue to plan and collect the information in this manner, and this assessment will be done every 5 years. And they may or may not, the government may or may not indicate whether they will need to revise. They may not revise or they may revise, but they'll continue to do that cycle. So let's have a look at what's new. So this is the new food guide. I just wanted to see a show of hands if anyone's seen the new guide. Okay, great. Have you seen a paper copy of the guide? Okay, has anyone seen the online guide? Okay, many more people are raising their hands that they've seen the online resource. And the reason is the government's trying to reduce the carbon footprint by not printing as much of the paper guide anymore. So this guide is done as an online resource. What you're seeing in front, this is the paper copy, and this is actually called the Food Guide Snapshot. But what you really want to be doing, if you can, is go on to the online resource where you'll see the food choices, the eating habits, recipes, and tips that make this new guide. You can even look on your mobile phone. So there's a mobile version where you can just go onto your phone and call up the website, and you'll see it's really easy to navigate. I want to go a little bit more in depth on what has changed. So I'll point out a few of the new features here. So you'll notice, as you saw in the other picture, there is a plate, and that's meant to be and help make the guide more simplified. It's very user-focused. So instead of having the portions and the serving sizes, which seem to confuse people, they made a plate to make it very simple and visual. They used the modern design and more of photography to highlight the different foods and the pattern of eating on the plate. There's 3 food groups. So it's narrowed down to 3 food groups, which is your whole grains, vegetable and fruit, and protein group. And that is a new terminology, but that terminology was easily recognized. So we wanted to use terms that were very familiar to people. And as well, you'll see that in the guide, there's a lot of diversity in the protein group, and you'll see more plant-based proteins as well as the dairy foods are now in the protein group. This guide also shows that there's a greater emphasis on plant-based eating. Plants being their vegetable and fruit, your grains, and then your plant sources of the proteins. That's why it's called more plant-based. The idea of using the term plant-based was also using terminology that people agreed on. The other part is that now water is promoted as a beverage of choice to quench thirst. And beyond the food guide, the style of eating is the focused on this guide, which is what we like. So there's a bit of focus on healthy eating behaviors, which there wasn't in the past. And again, just to highlight that, yes, you want to go online to look at the resources, and as well, what was new is that there was no industry report. So what do the food guidelines say? So there are some guiding principles. These are a bit more detailed, but I do want to share them. So the more simple model of the food guide online doesn't necessarily highlight these guiding principles, but I wanted to share them with you. These go to the policymakers and healthcare professionals, but I think they're really important. So the first guideline is called the Foundation for Healthy Eating. This is to say that vegetable, fruit, whole grain, and protein foods should be consumed regularly. And among the protein foods, consume plant-based more often. And why is that? It's because this pattern of eating emphasizes, again, this plant-based, which typically results in a higher intake of vegetable fruit, nuts, soy protein, and fiber, and lower intakes of processed foods and foods that contain mostly saturated fat. So eating more vegetable and fruit and eating more nuts and soy and high fiber intake is linked with improved cholesterol levels and reducing the risk for cardiovascular disease, and also lowering the risk for colon cancer and type 2 diabetes. Whereas processed meats are linked more to the colorectal cancers, and foods that contain more saturated fat had been linked to higher cholesterol levels and a higher risk for type 2 diabetes. Oops, sorry, hang on. There was a little bit more on the foundation of eating, that foods that contain mostly unsaturated fat should be replaced by foods that contain mostly saturated fats. And I'll define that in a moment. But the intention is not to be reducing the total amount of fat. The idea is to replace these fats. So say at breakfast time, instead of putting butter on toast, it would be a healthier fat like avocado on toast as an example, or choosing a whole grain like oatmeal. Whereas at lunch, it could be something, instead of going for a deli meat sandwich, which is higher in saturated fat, would be choosing something like tuna, or going for something like a Buddha bowl or a poke bowl, if you've heard of these things. And at dinner, it would be, instead of putting the steak or the ribs on the barbecue that are high in saturated fat, it'd be more looking at taking a fish or some shrimp or some tofu and for example, putting that on a barbecue at dinner, because that's lower sources of saturated fat. The next guideline is that process and prepared foods that contribute excess sodium, free sugars, and saturated fat should not be consumed so regularly. They undermine the healthy eating. So some of these processed foods would include what you see in the picture here, sort of like the fried foods, cookies, cakes, confections, sugary drinks, and frozen packaged dinners, because of their concentration of, say, high sodium intake, which can, again, be one of the reasons that is associated with high blood pressure. And more than half of Canadians consume above the recommended amount of sodium in their daily intake. Saturated fats are the fats that are found in animal-based products, such as cheeses and meats that are rich in fat, or the skin on poultry, palm kernel, or coconut oils. So 1 in 2 Canadians actually consume above the recommended amount of saturated fat, and saturated fat have been leading to a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And the last foundation would be that water would be the, oops, sorry, keep going ahead. Water would be the beverage of choice because water promotes hydration without adding the extra calories and sugars. So next, we're going to look at the last guiding principle, which was called the importance of food skill. So many Canadians are faced with the food environment where there are processed foods that are highly available, competitively priced, and offered in large portions and heavily marketed. And this change in our food environment has sort of shaped and changed the pattern of our eating. And over time, Canadians seem to be spending more of their budget on processed food. So the idea is to get back to the importance of using some of our food skills so that we can cook food at home or prepare and do simple basic snacks or meals with food skill. So this would be taught in more of the institutions just to encourage more building on these skills. We feel that Health Canada feels that food skills, of course, are a very important life skill. Also, with that in mind, label reading comes under this category. So you'll notice that on the food guide, when you go to the website, there's a whole information on the food label. Canadians need to be more informed, so using the food label to make informed decisions. So there's a nutrient fact table on foods where you can see the % daily value of a nutrient, and you can tell if a product has a little or a lot of nutrients such as sodium just by looking at that guide, and that can help you to reduce, say for example, your sodium intake. And also under the importance of food skills, we see that, sorry, one other thing here. There we go, okay. I just wanted to mention, because I skipped over that part, but I thought it was pretty important to mention that what's going to happen too is that some of these policies will come into our institutions to reduce some of the processed foods and beverages that are served in schools and in other institutions. So the idea is the policy will help to reduce those processed foods also in other parts of the community. So the main message of the food guide is to eat a variety of healthy foods every day. As you could see from the plate method, focusing more on the vegetables and the fruit as a main part of the daily day-to-day pattern, including more of the plant proteins on a day-to-day basis, pulling in your food skills to try to build some more skills around simple and easy meals to make for yourself. So in some ways, the food guide that we use today has evolved and is quite different from the food rules that we began with in the 1940s. But in other ways, it's not at all. It still has the underlying intent to guide and promote the nutritional health of Canadians. So as a tool, it's really supporting Canadians in the direction of making healthy meals and try to find some healthy eating habits or work on healthy eating habits. And then for anyone that's looking for more of the specialized nutritional needs because of a special diet, then they would be working with a registered dietitian to create more of an individualized plan. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Marcia. If anyone has a question specific to Marcia's presentation, please write it on the white card that was on your seat and hold it up right now because someone will be able to collect it shortly if there's any questions. Okay, I'll now introduce our next speaker. So Jill Zweig is a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator with Sunnybrook's academic family health team. Please welcome Jill as she helps us make sense of all of those diets in the headlines.
Oops. I'm not very technical. Oh. Where's my slide? Thanks, Caitlin. Welcome, everybody, to my talk this evening called Diet in the Headlines. No matter where you look, you will find newspaper articles, magazine covers, news stories, and of course, social media blogs and advertisements on some kind of magic cure for health or weight. As you can see, we can't escape the topic. The objectives for my talk this evening are by the end of my presentation, you will be able to interpret diets in the headlines, recognize strengths and weaknesses of current diet fads, define the components of healthy style of eating, and possibly revise your eating patterns, incorporating even one small change. We are bombarded each and every day with messages about weight, body size, and shape, what we eat, what to avoid, quick fixes, and so on. We are also exposed to messages on food packaging, and all of this exposure influences our food knowledge, our food perceptions, ideas, and beliefs about ourselves and the food that we eat. Of course, there's all the books that you can find in a bookstore, on Amazon, online, and any of those will quickly fix how you look, your weight, your health, just by following some instructions. This magazine says I can lose 50 pounds in a week by eating chocolate cake 3 times a day. Finally, a diet that makes sense. Easy, isn't it? Nutrition research is complex and often oversimplified by the media. Reports may include preliminary study findings that are not verified by additional research, or report on a study that contradicts current health recommendations. The goal is often to create attention-grabbing headlines which lead to more profits for the diet industry and advertising. But what about what the research really says? In order to look at research, the following should be considered. Research is ongoing. New studies are always being published. Therefore, guidelines may change as new research is available. But contradictions occur. This is the healthy part of the scientific process. Not all scientific studies are created equal. Some are more reliable than others. Newer studies are not necessarily more reliable than older studies. Let's look briefly at a few of the recent studies that have created hype about certain diets in the headlines. With a constant stream of information, how can one make the distinction between reliable research, research from weak studies, and sensational headlines? Fad diets have created a multi-billion-dollar industry. Dietary guidelines have focused on all of the above. As Sister Ann mentioned, low carb or high carb, low fat or high fat, what type of fat, how much fat, ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting. All of these work to promote short-term weight loss, and they've gained substantial popularity. The data on many of these diets is limited. and the results are often conflicting. What are the long-term health outcomes? I'm not sure that we know. I'm going to talk about two studies to start. I'll be talking about a number, but the first study we're going to look at was published in the Lancet Public Health in 2018. It looked at approximately 15,000 adults between the ages of 45 and 64 years old, and the follow-up was over approximately 25 years. The study was looking for an association between the percentage of energy from carbohydrate intake and all-cause mortality, and whether the substitution of animal or plant sources of fat and protein for carbohydrate affected mortality. The findings, both high, greater than 70%, and low, less than 40% intake of carbohydrate, were associated with increased mortality. The lowest or minimal risk was observed when carbohydrate intake was between 50 to 55% of one's calories. Low carbohydrate dietary patterns favoring animal proteins such as beef, pork, chicken, and lamb were associated with higher mortality, whereas those that favored plant-based proteins and fats such as peanut butter, nuts, whole grains were associated with lower mortality. This suggests that the source of food modifies the association between carbohydrate intake and mortality. The recommendations from the New Canada's Food Guide, as Marcia talked about, eating more plant-based protein is optimal and can be supported by this data. Plant-based proteins and fats should be considered as a long-term approach to healthy eating and healthy aging. The next study that I'm going to talk about is called the PURE study, and it was published in the Lancet in 2017. It included approximately 135,000 participants from 18 countries, and they were followed for an average of 7.5 years. The results reported that a high carbohydrate diet was associated with an increased risk of mortality and higher fat intakes, including saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats, and animal proteins were each associated with a lower mortality. Total fat and types of fats were not associated with cardiovascular risk or MI risk. This is the opposite of what we have always thought. And this has piqued the diet industry and caused some healthcare professionals to shift their focus in terms of dietary advice. But remember, this is one study. All research has limitations that should be considered when making population-based recommendations. Some of the PURE study limitations include the following. The food frequency questionnaires were used to estimate participants' dietary intake. This does not measure absolute intake. It's self-reported with many measurement errors in reporting, which can lead to random errors and dilute real associations. Dietary intakes were only measured at baseline. Dietary changes that occurred over the study were not noted. There's also a potential for what's called social desirability. People who volunteer to participate in these studies may also adjust other health-conscious behaviors, such as exercise behaviors or look at stress management. This was an observational study. Associations may be due to other confounding factors. The study was not able to quantify the types of carbohydrate. So carbohydrate in low and middle income countries could mainly be from refined sources. Trans fats were not measured, and this can affect the results. There are still many questions to be answered before we can make universal recommendations. What constitutes a healthy diet? I'm not sure we truly know. Here is an example of something we might read or might be portrayed in the news, and I'll take a moment to read it out. Eating carbohydrate drives up insulin production. The hypothesis suggests stirring hunger and causing the body to hold on to fat and suppress calorie burn. But when you replace carbohydrates with fat, you subdue hunger, boost calorie burn, and melt away fat. With fewer carbs, your body doesn't produce as much insulin, and that increases the rate of ketogenesis and decreases the body's need for glucose. This might sound great, but what's often lost in the boosterism is that this is still just a hypothesis. Most studies of ketogenic and very low carbohydrate diets suggest that they actually don't outperform others in the long term when it comes to weight loss. Healthcare professionals may take single case studies or anecdotal stories about themselves, clients, colleagues, family members, and convince us that these associations are research-based. Remember, there may be many factors in the story that have contributed to one person's success. Let's look at some pros and cons of popular diets. Very popular lately is something called the ketogenic diet. How many of you have heard the words, "I'm eating keto"? Do you really know what that means? I have to tell you, every time someone comes into my office and uses these words, I ask them to describe what it means to them, and everyone comes up with a different version. Let's take a look at what it actually means. A ketogenic diet is one that restricts carbohydrate to very minimal. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, the average person eats somewhere between about 150 and 250, or maybe more, grams of carbohydrate a day. A ketogenic diet is restricting carbohydrate to generally less than 50 grams of carbohydrate a day. In fact, there's actually no consensus on what a ketogenic or how much carbohydrate a ketogenic diet is, because everybody is different. It's supposed to restrict carbohydrate to the point that the body converts protein and fat for energy, which then produces a byproduct called ketones. When ketones build up, for some people, they can become toxic, especially for people with diabetes. Remember, carbohydrate is not just starch foods like bread, pasta, and rice. It's also whole grains, beans, lentils, all fruits, and vegetables. So basically, a ketogenic diet eliminates almost all carbohydrate, which means no starch, no fruit, no rice, potato, pasta, bread, no vegetables, no whole grains. Well, that doesn't sound too bad, but then there's no fruit and a limited intake of nuts and seeds. So I ask you, what is left to eat? Anytime you restrict your intake or cut out an entire food group, it will most likely result in weight loss, a benefit in blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes management. But what about the long-term effects? Vitamin and mineral deficiencies, lack of fiber, effects on heart health and cholesterol, because often to replace that, you eat more protein and fats. Restricting carbohydrate intake can also lead to the breakdown of muscle. A meta-analysis and randomized control trial published in 2016 in the British Journal of Nutrition found varying results. Weight loss in the low carbohydrate diet versus the low fat diet was slightly greater, but there was found to be an increase in LDL cholesterol. And I think we all know that LDL cholesterol is associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So I think it's safe to say that one must look at the benefits versus the risk or detrimental effects of different diets. Some of the risks associated with a ketogenic diet and some of the symptoms that one might experience are lethargy, flu-like symptoms, reduced athletic performance on high-intensity exercises, and of course, if you have diabetes, you're at increased risk of diabetic ketoacidosis, otherwise known as DKA, which can be dangerous. There are no long-term research studies lasting more than 1 year, and there is no consensus in the literature on the benefits and very few recent studies on ketogenic diets. The bottom line has been shown in research consistently that if you can follow an eating style indefinitely, you may get some benefits. But any changes to eating habits or restrictions have been shown to promote weight loss and health as long as you follow them. The reality becomes a question of, is this a style of eating that is right for you? Struggling to lose weight? Intermittent fasting could cause dieters to shed pounds in weeks by stimulating cells to burn fat, reveals study. Intermittent fasting is another popular diet strategy. This can take several forms. For example, one might fast from 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. So that's like a 12-hour fast. Or they may fast one day and eat regular the next. Tonight, we're going to focus on something called the 5-2 approach, which is defined as eating 5 days without energy restriction and 2 days with a 75% energy deficit. Overall, over a week, that leads to approximately 20% decrease in caloric intake. A study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2018 looked at the effects of intermittent fasting and continuous caloric restriction on body weight and metabolism over 50 weeks, a randomized controlled trial. So that is a solid scientific study. The results showed that the 5-2 approach may be equivalent, but not superior, to the calorie-restricted or controlled routine for weight reduction and prevention of metabolic diseases. This study included 150 men and women who were body mass index between 25 and 40, and the study duration was 1 year. So not a particularly large study, but it was a randomized control trial. Another study published in the Nutrition, Metabolism, and Cardiovascular Disease Journal in 2018 looked at the effects of intermittent fasting versus continuous energy restriction on weight loss, maintenance, and cardiometabolic risks. Also a randomized controlled trial. The results? Both groups resulted in similar weight loss, maintenance, and cardiovascular risk after 1 year. However, feelings of hunger were more pronounced during the intermittent energy restriction. There is no magic or quick fix. Additional knowledge is needed to learn more about the mechanisms involved, optimal frequency, and duration of intermittent fasting. One must also consider healthy individuals as well as someone with health risks, existing cardiovascular disease, diabetes, other chronic health conditions. That's not saying this doesn't work for some, but again, we go back to how long, sustainability, and at what cost. Safety, emotional relationship with food, is that a struggle? There is some commentary on intermittent fasting is leading up to disordered eating or eating disorders. And at what benefit? As previously mentioned, all of these studies have limitations, but overall, the point is anything can work as long as you can follow it, making healthy behavior changes. It's important to think about what works best and what's going to work for you in the long term. Another popular diet is the Mediterranean style diet. And this is actually more a style of eating rather than a diet, as it provides guidelines of food groups to choose more often and less often based on this pyramid. This is one of the few styles of eating that actually has long-term research studies showing positive outcomes. The PREDIMED study was a landmark study that was designed to assess the long-term effects of Mediterranean diets. The outcomes looked at the overall incidence of cardiovascular disease in high-risk individuals. The study was a multi-center study. There were 7,500 participants. About 3,600 of those participants had existing type 2 diabetes. Both males and females were included between the ages of 55 to 80. And by the time of enrollment, no participants had cardiovascular disease, but as I mentioned, some of the participants had type 2 diabetes or other risk factors such as high blood pressure, cholesterol, overweight, or were smokers. The participants were randomly assigned to one of three groups. One group, the control group, was advised on eating a lower fat diet. The second group, was advised on Mediterranean-style eating with a supplement of olive oil. And the third group was advised on Mediterranean-style eating with a supplement of nuts. There was no calorie restriction or any intervention on exercise for any of the participants. The PREDIMED study showed for the first time in a randomized controlled trial that a traditional Mediterranean-style eating pattern protects against cardiovascular disease. There was a 30% cardiovascular disease risk reduction after 5 years, and the study was stopped early because these benefits were so significant. Other research has been done showing the similar benefits of Mediterranean-style diets, and they continue to show a reduction in risk and mortality from cardiovascular disease. You may have heard of one of those other studies. It was called the Lion's Heart Study. Generally, a Mediterranean style of eating, not dissimilar to the Canada's New Food Guide, is characterized by higher intakes of vegetables, fruit, nuts, olive oil, and whole grains. It encourages including fish, seafood, and vegetarian meals more often, limiting intake of red meats, processed meats, and sweets. And it does include wine in moderation. In the Mediterranean diet, an average of 35 to 40% of calories come from fat. This is a little different than heart-healthy guidelines because they're generally less than 35% of your calories come from fat. But the fats allowed in Mediterranean-style eating are mainly from unsaturated sources, such as olive oil, canola oil, sunflower, safflower, flax seeds, as well as fish, which provides us with some omega-3 and 6 fatty acids and fish oils. These types of oils may have a protective effect on the heart. But the Mediterranean style of eating is not just about a diet, it's about a lifestyle that encourages eating meals with family and friends, eating smaller portions of high quality foods, focusing on fresh foods in season, and it emphasizes cooking from scratch and moving away from processed packaged goods. Again, similar to what Marcia talked about. The dietary debate in the scientific community and in the media continues. It continues to be about optimal macronutrients, but the reality has shed little light on obesity. The results have shown small benefits, but most significant is the ability to adhere to a particular style of eating and exercise. The macronutrient content, carbohydrate, protein, and fat of one's diet may play a small role, but it is really not part of adherence. The assumption is also that one type of diet is best for everyone, and this simply may not be the case. Just like medication, behavioral intervention, diet, and exercise will only be effective when the treatment is active. I should go on a diet, but I'm afraid my brain will get thinner and I'll become narrow-minded. Just to finish up with an inspirational quote, Don't fear change. You may lose something good, but you may also gain something great. Remember, eat, drink, and be healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Just a reminder, if you have a question, just raise your hand or raise your card, and the volunteers will be around once again to pick those questions up. We had lots of questions from the first chat, so it's nice to see that everyone's thinking about nutrition. Okay, I'll now introduce our final presenter of the evening. So Annie Huang is a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator with Sunnybrook's academic family health team. Tonight, Annie will talk about Beyond the Plate, impactful tips and tricks. Please welcome her to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to take us beyond the plate because for the first time ever, Canada's Food Guide has an entire section devoted to providing Canadians with actionable advice on healthy eating habits. I will focus on these 4 recommendations that advise us beyond the plate. They are: be mindful of your eating habits, cook more often, enjoy your food, and eat meals with others. Be mindful of your eating habits. Being mindful can help you create a sense of awareness around your everyday eating decisions. It can help you be more conscious of the food choices and your eating habits. It can help you reconnect to the eating experience by creating an awareness of your emotions, thoughts, and behaviors related to eating. So what is mindfulness? The Center for Mindfulness Studies defines mindfulness as a way of paying attention to whatever is happening in our lives, inside and out, in the present moment. Mindfulness is a skill that can be practiced and honed by focusing your attention on the present with curiosity rather than judgment. So the next time you have a food craving, instead of thinking if your craving is good or bad, approach it with curiosity. What does your craving feel like? Does your stomach grumble? Do your thoughts wander? Is your mouth watering? When you eat, do you eat mindfully? Do you pay attention to the appearance of the food, the presentation, the color? Do you notice the smell of your food? Is it a strong scent? Is it sweet? Do you pay attention to the sound of your food? Is it crunchy? Is it squishy? Do you notice the taste of your food? Do you really taste your food? Do you notice the flavors, the ingredients? Mindfulness requires an intentionally intuitive style of eating. An intuitive eater might be prompted to eat by their biological hunger. An intuitive eater makes food choices without guilt and honors their hunger and fullness. In contrast, a careful eater might be more triggered to eat by fitness and health, and this type of eater seems to be more perfectionistic and maybe even anguishes over their food choices. An unconscious eater is often a multitasker, often unaware of how much is eaten. And eating alone often seems like a waste of time to not do something else to be productive. A chaotic eater might be somebody with a very busy and overscheduled life. A chaotic eater is somebody who's maybe having a more haphazard style of eating, sort of eating whenever they can, grabbing a bite whenever it's available. Your refuse not unconscious eater is the person who is prompted to eat by the presence of food. this type of eater might be more vulnerable to the food that or the food that's available at somebody's house or just sitting on the counter. This person might be more vulnerable to food available at meetings at work, for example. Your waste not unconscious eater, somebody who's prompted by free food and often makes food choices based on the value of the dollar. So this type of eater would be more susceptible to seeing a good deal or promotion at a restaurant or a grocery store, might be more vulnerable at buffets.
Attention please, code white, alpha ground, 186, x-ray room. Attention please, code white, alpha ground, 186, x-ray room.
The emotional unconscious eater, somebody who might be eating triggered by uncomfortable emotions, maybe eating under stress, or maybe eating to celebrate a wonderful day. And then you have your professional dieter. Your professional dieter might feel triggered to eat by feeling quote unquote fat. And I put that in quotations because fat isn't necessarily a feeling, but fat might be related to a thought about one's body image. And a professional dieter is often trying the latest fads. So mindful eating is really a process involving curiosity, asking yourself questions about your eating experience. Why do you eat? When do you eat? What, how much, and where do you eat? You ever think about why you eat? We often use the word hunger, but we can break hunger down into 3 different ways. One way is stomach hunger. Stomach hunger is your physiological drive to eat. This is your body's requirement for fuel. Your stomach might be growling. It might be many hours since you've last eaten. Sometimes we eat out of mouth hunger. And mouth hunger is really a type of hunger that's driven by your senses. So for example, you might be craving a certain taste, like something sweet or maybe something salty and crunchy. Or maybe you've walked past a coffee shop and you've smelled the delicious coffee and you see the beautiful pastries, and that might prompt another type of hunger. And then we have heart hunger. And heart hunger is related often with the emotions. So heart hunger might be feeling a desire to eat because you've had a wonderful day and you want to treat yourself and just have something a little extra special. Or it might be because you've had an awful day and I don't care anymore. I'm just going to eat this. Or it might be out of boredom. You're looking for something to do, so you meander into the kitchen, and that's another type of hunger. Another tool we can use to begin a more mindful eating practice is a hunger scale. And so a hunger scale looks at how hungry and how full you are. So 0 on the scale is you're very hungry. You know that phrase, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. You might even feel like you have a headache. You might even be feeling a bit irritable at this stage. 5 is neutral. You're not really hungry. You're not really full. And 10 is you're so full. You're so stuffed. Maybe your pants are a little bit tight. Maybe you have a stomach ache. You might even feel a little bit nauseous. It's a skill to practice this mindful eating and to use a hunger scale. And you might start by thinking about what it feels like when you feel hungry. What are your body's signs that tell you when you're hungry? Because if you don't know what it feels like to be hungry, and you're not eating out of hunger, how will you know when to stop? Also consider what it feels like to be satisfied. Satiety is a fleeting moment that happens before fullness. Satiety is that feeling where you've eaten just enough that you could go on for a few more hours without eating. But it happens before your body feels physically full. When you practice discovering your body's cues for hunger and fullness, you can try using a hunger scale, and this can allow you to practice honoring your body's hunger and fullness in a more mindful eating way. Another idea is to consider where you eat. How many of you have ever eaten in front of a computer, in front of the TV, in the car? I'm not the only one. I didn't think I would be the only one, but I admit I have too. Sometimes eating becomes an afterthought, and we live in a very fast-paced world that can be very demanding. And eating alone as an activity on its own is happening less and less. So think about how often do you eat as an event on its own and carve out time to devote just to eating. The second healthy habit that's recommended by the Canada's Food Guide is to cook more often. Cooking more often allows us to have more control and to know what's in our food. We can choose the ingredients, we can control and adjust the amount of seasoning and sauces. We can learn more skills, we rely less on highly processed foods, and we can even save money. Like I said, in our fast-paced world, this can be very difficult. One common barrier to cooking more often is that we are busier than ever before. We have less access to supermarkets and fresh produce, and we have more access to convenience prepared and processed foods. It's all too easy to pick up a pizza through delivery, by phone, by internet, on your phone, or even just take one out of the freezer. So if cooking more often is so effortful, sometimes it can be very helpful to have some easy ingredients on hand at home to make this a little bit easier. So consider the Canada's Food Guide. We can use the plate as a little bit of a guide to think about which foods we should have on hand, starting with the vegetables and fruits. We now have lots of pre-washed, pre-cut types of fruits and vegetables available to us in the supermarkets. It can be really helpful to take a shortcut here, especially when we know from Canadian health surveys that fruits and vegetables are often inadequate in an average Canadian diet. So consider your boxed salads, your frozen vegetables and fruits. Make this part a little bit easier for yourself. In terms of protein foods, it can be helpful to have foods that are really quick to cook. We don't often have time to make a roast or do a whole chicken in the oven anymore. So it can be helpful to have some foods that require very little to no cooking, maybe some nuts, tofu, beans, some canned fish, or maybe some quick cooking protein foods like eggs. Why not a frittata or some scrambled eggs for your protein for dinner, or some ground meat that can be browned in the skillet. And finally, some whole grain foods. We can get some whole grain foods that are ready to eat, like a nice whole grain bread, or we can batch cook. So we can cook foods in larger quantities. You can cook grains like quinoa and brown rice and leave them in the refrigerator or the freezer for when you need them. And I know potatoes technically are a vegetable, but nutritionally they're starchy like grains. And there are some great products out there that are pre-washed already that require less cooking time for potatoes, or you can batch cook if you want to do a couple of larger potatoes and have them ready for you when you need a quick meal. So it can be helpful to build a repertoire of go-to meals for those times you're in a crunch, or you just don't have the energy to cook those nights. Be sure to double check for nutrition balance. Take, for example, these two meals here. We've got some tea with jam and tea with toast and jam. And in this meal, we're really missing some protein and vegetables and fruit. Contrast that to the sandwich with some eggs for some protein and some sliced up cucumbers for some vegetables. You can add some extra food groups on the side if you like. There's some milk and a fruit. And that would be a more complete meal. The third message is to enjoy your food. So enjoying your food means reconnecting with your food, maybe trying new foods, and enjoying the foods that you like to eat. On the top left corner There's an image of something growing out of a flower. Does anybody know what that is? Zucchini. Zucchini. Yeah, it's a zucchini flower. I had no idea that in a zucchini plant, where you see the little yellow flowers, that is where the squash grows. Sometimes we don't remember or we don't know what our food looks like anymore in nature. What about the bottom left picture? Does anybody know what that is? Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts. I was baffled the first time I saw Brussels sprouts on a stalk. I had only ever seen Brussels sprouts in their individual sprouts. It just reminded me that I'm so disconnected from what food looks like in nature. The upper right-hand corner with the flowers. Anybody know what that is? Saffron, yes, it's saffron. No wonder this is the world's most expensive spice. The little red strands are what we use as saffron. So somebody's gone through the flowers and picked each one off. Amazing. And the bottom right picture, anybody knows what that is? Cashews. Cashews. I saw a cashew tree once, and it's a big, beautiful tree, and they're called, I believe they're called cashew apples. To me, it looks sort of like a bell pepper to me. And at the bottom of each fruit is one cashew. Amazing. And again, it reminded me, goodness, I don't know where my food comes from, and I don't necessarily know what food looks like in nature. And I think in general, in our urban society, we're quite disconnected from our food. We don't know what all of our food looks like anymore. And I'm not just talking about fruits and vegetables, but also our animal products. We don't always know where they come from. So if you're looking for a way to reconnect with your food, you might consider maybe visiting a farmer's market. There are many in Toronto that are popping up now. Maybe you'll start growing your own food. You could start with a little herb garden at home, or maybe even a couple of plants in your backyard. And some of you here might be very avid gardeners and can tell me a lot more about food and nature. Enjoying your food also means enjoying your food. So what I'm saying here is that you don't have to eat a Canadian diet to follow Canada's food guide. After all, what is Canada but a mosaic of diverse cultures? So you can build your meal a number of ways. We have here a cold meal and a hot meal. We have a niçoise salad in the upper left corner, and the bottom is a hot meal, some soy sauce chicken with brown rice and broccoli. Your meal can be a South Asian meal like the top right corner, or it can be a Mediterranean meal like the bottom right corner. So following Canada's food guide or having a healthy meal can take many forms. Finally, the last message is to eat meals with others. And we know eating meals with others can help you enjoy more quality time together and help you share the pleasure of food, because eating is an experience. There's even really good research to show that social eating is beneficial for families with young children. So young children can benefit from the role modeling of the adults at the dinner table. And we even know that adolescents who have more family meals are more likely to spend more time on homework, read for pleasure, have lower risk of unhealthy weight control practices, lower substance use, sexual activity, and lower signs of depression. And older adults can sometimes find it a challenge to eat with others, because as we get older, a lot of times our families get smaller. Family members move away. You might be in a household of one or two. And so encouraging some meals with friends or family can bring back that social eating. And we also know that eating with others can also, it has been linked with improved overall diet quality and actually increased fruit and vegetable intake in older adults. So these are just some healthy habits that's recommended by Canada's Food Guide. And healthy habits are learned just the same way as unhealthy ones, through practice. So consider some of these habits. Consider practicing mindfulness when you eat, cooking more often at home, finding ways to enjoy your food, and perhaps inviting some others to be around. It doesn't mean that you have to do all 4 things every time that you eat, but it can guide you to build a healthier pattern and some healthier eating habits. Because after all, food is not just fuel for the body. Food is social, cultural, and most of all, enjoyable. So let's embrace all that food has to offer, because we don't eat nutrients, we eat food. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Annie. So Annie's presentation concludes the presentations for tonight. So we'll now begin our question and answer session. So if anyone still has a question or a card left, we'll collect them now. So just raise your hand, raise your card, and we'll start off the session. So I'll just ask Marcia, Jill, and Annie to join us up here, and we'll make our way through. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we do have some repeats. So I'm just going to take a minute to organize here. Thank you. Okay, so we'll get started with a first question. So the first question is where to get a printed copy of the food guide.
There we go. Can you hear now? Okay, so the printed copy of the guide can be ordered on the Canada Food online. So you can go to Canada Food Guide online and order it from there. I'm just trying to think if that wouldn't be helpful. Yeah.
On the Canada's Food Guide website, there's also a printable PDF version of the food guide. So if you prefer to print it on your own printer rather than ordering one, you can do that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So the next question is, if you are following a low cholesterol diet, what is the best spread to use? Butter or plant-based?
So if you're following a diet for low cholesterol, you want to weigh off your pros and cons. Butter is a saturated fat and contains about 68% saturated fat, as where margarine is about 8% saturated fat. So margarine is higher in unsaturated fat. There are many reasons why people may choose one or the other, but you also want to look at what are your other sources of saturated fat. In order to reduce that LDL cholesterol, we're looking at major contributing factors or major sources of saturated fat. So if you're someone who's eating a lot of meat, a lot of higher fat dairy, skin on chicken, or higher fat foods or foods with more processed foods with hidden fats, you may want to definitely choose margarine. If you're somebody who's a little leery about choosing margarine and you prefer to use butter, you really want to look at, is there other sources or other ways you can reduce your intake of saturated fat in order to accommodate small amounts of butter.
Okay. So the next question is, are genetically modified foods dangerous, helpful, safe, or organic foods better? That was like 4 questions in one, but.
There are many reasons somebody might think about choosing organic foods or genetically modified foods. In fact, in Canada, there are very few foods that are available that are genetically modified foods. So in Canada, let's see if I can remember this, it's only about a handful. We currently have canola, sugar beet, cotton, not a food, corn, soybean, and the new Arctic apple. Am I missing anything? I think that's it. So 6 foods currently that are available in Canada that are genetically modified. So when you're walking in the grocery store, and I know sometimes our friends joke and say, oh, these strawberries look big, they must be genetically modified. That's not true. We only have 6 foods in Canada that are genetically modified. From a nutrition standpoint, genetically modified foods and organic foods are equivalent. There's no superiority in terms of nutrition quality, like things like vitamins, for example. There's no superiority. You might choose genetically modified foods or organic foods based on some other reasons. Of course, a food system is complex. You may be considering other things like sustainability, food policy, economics, pesticide use. So these are things that might affect your decision as well. I'll just say again, nutritionally, there's no difference. And then I also want to add that in terms of pesticide use, probably the best studied pesticides where we have the most information and the most safety information are some of the conventional pesticides. So this is potentially a long answer, but I hope this version of the answer will answer whoever's question that is. Lots to consider. Anything to add?
Okay, thank you. All right, we had a few questions around this topic, so I'm just going to paraphrase and summarize. But the question is around tofu and soy and estrogen related to cancer risk.
So when we talk about soy and tofu and plant-based proteins, we're talking about the person who is generally healthy and doesn't have any other chronic disease or illnesses. There are definitely some associations in people who may have certain types of cancers. That have been questions, and that would need to be dealt with on an individualized basis. These guidelines are, again, population-based and generalized.
Absolutely. In general, the types of cancers that Jill's talking about are very specific cancers. There's also been studies that show that soy is protective of some cancers. So, and also actually protective for the heart in terms of lowering cholesterol. So there are actually many health benefits to soy, and if you have a particular condition, you can ask your physician or dietitian about it. But for most people, soy is actually very protective and healthy. And also, just one more thing, consider that in Canada, we don't have a high soy intake, right? And so when people are concerned about eating soy, when we're talking about a high soy intake, we're either talking about soy supplementation or we're talking about daily intake of soy, like 3 servings or more, which is really not, for many Canadians, not the amount that we're eating. So for most of us, we don't have to worry about any high amounts of soy, and especially if you don't have any particular type of cancer, that the types that are related to this.
Okay, we had a few questions related to water. So first, how much water is recommended to drink per day? What are your thoughts about carbonated water, or do we need to include beverages that have electrolytes like coconut water?
Okay, so in relation to water, the idea that water is now the beverage of choice is to replace sugary beverages. So the idea is to lower your intake of sugary beverages by including water more frequently. And you're getting fluids not just from water, you may get it from other water containing things in your diet, which might be soup or coffee or tea, which aren't really high also in sugars or fats that we were trying to reduce. You'll also get fluids from some of your soy beverages, your rice beverages, or you can get it from almond beverage. These types of things are also fortified, and they're sources of fluid in your diet that you can have, but you're just trying to choose the ones that aren't as sweetened. So you're trying to compare labels to see that you're choosing ones that are lower in added sugars. And you'll get fluids also through the soups that you have or the sauces that you're taking. So fluids come in many forms in your diet. There isn't really an 8 glass a day recommendation overall for everyone to take, but the idea is to recognize thirst, to keep hydrated in high temperatures, to really be aware that we do need fluids in our diet.
I'm just going to add to that in terms of the sort of the electrolytes or coconut water. So coconut water actually is a sugar-based beverage. It has a natural source of carbohydrate in it, so it would be under not considered a water, even though it has water, and that's the same as many of those sports drinks. The ones that are not sugar-based will have artificial sweeteners, and again, if people are comfortable, they may choose that as an alternative, but really we're looking at water. We don't need electrolytes in general for hydration. And the other one was carbonated. So carbonated waters like Perrier's, those definitely can be included, and sometimes they have a little flavoring in them, and that's just from a little squirt of lemon juice or lime, and really no significant amount of sugar or carbohydrate, and it is an alternative. It is a water-based drink.
And then just adding on to that, we've just had the addition of what about alkaline water?
From everything we know from the scientific evidence out there, we cannot change the pH balance of our body through ingestion of food or drink. So oftentimes the purpose of alkaline water is to try to lower the acidity in the body, and physiologically that simply won't happen. Our bodies are very well regulated through a variety of our organs to regulate the pH balance that we have in a very tight, narrow range. In fact, if your body is overly acidic, a body that is overly acidic would be in the ICU. This is not something that we can change through food or drink. So I'm afraid to say that alkaline water is probably a marketing technique, as there are many out there.
It's those headlines that they're aiming for, and a way to promote a product.
Okay, so moving on, there were a few questions related to which oils should be used for cooking, especially for frying or at high temperature, and is coconut oil recommended for cooking?
Okay. So, there are tables out there that can talk to you and then tell you, and you can look at for a guide for the different smoke points of the different oils. Sometimes, an oil that's more monounsaturated might potentially smoke at a higher temperature. So say, for example, an oil like olive oil at a very, very high temperature, you might see that gives off a little bit more smoke. There might be some oils that tolerate heat a little bit better. Something like a canola oil or a grapeseed oil. I think the idea behind the smoke point too is we don't really want to be cooking our foods at such high temperatures. We really do want to cook our foods not at such high temperatures and causing any charring and extra smoke anyway. So we don't want to put the temperature up so high and cook very high. It's good to cook slow and at lower or moderate temperatures, and use the thermometer to test, of course, the meat or whatever you're cooking to be sure the internal temperature is safe.
Most pan frying that you do does not get up to anywhere near the smoke point. I know that's been a big issue with olive oil over the past number of years, and people are a little bit concerned about doing a little pan frying with olive oil. And that has not, when you're doing a little bit of pan frying, you're not reaching anywhere close to the smoke point of olive oil. So it is safe to use. Of course, we're not recommending deep frying at high temperatures at all. So any of the oils can really be used. The issue with coconut oil is, actually I just read an article this morning. So coconut oil is actually...
Please return to your unit on Delta 3. Attention please, attention please. Mary McNeil, please return to your unit on Delta 3.
Coconut oil is actually considered to be a saturated fat. So even though it's plant-based, it's about 80% saturated. And when you think about it, butter is actually only about 68% saturated. We do know that saturated fat is directly linked to an increase in LDL cholesterol, which is a risk factor for heart disease. That has been proven by many studies. And we really have not seen any significant health benefits to using coconut oil. So again, it's looking at risks and benefits, and what are the benefits is unclear to healthcare professionals. So coconut oil, I would be careful of, especially if you have elevated cholesterol or taking medication for cholesterol or risk for heart disease. Again, very much those headlines that I talked about earlier and promoting that.
Okay. So the next question is, where can I find simple, nutritious recipes, especially if one is short on time or food skills? Yeah, period.
So again, on the online resource, Canada's Food Guide does have recipes available on the website, which can be really helpful. I'm trying to think, dietitians also have a website. It's not Food Cookspiration. Also is a really great app that you can have on your phone or look at the website. I'm trying to think of one other
There's
one. That's
also Unlock Food.
Unlock Food, that's it. Yeah, so Unlock Food, the potential for, we actually use a lot of their recipes. They're really fantastic. You'll see breakfast, lunch, snack, all sorts of side dishes. And these are websites that have built with dietitians. So they have looked at recipes. So it's called Unlock Food, Cookspiration, or the Canada's Food Guide.
Okay. Are dehydrated fruits and vegetables healthier than regular fruits and vegetables?
Dried fruit? Yes. Dried fruit?
Yeah.
I wouldn't think so.
Not necessarily healthier. I don't think if they're simply dehydrated, then it just might be. I'm trying to think of some vegetables that are dehydrated. What are some examples?
Well, I guess you can get things like those dried pea things. Like, to me,
Okay.
that's like a snack.
Yeah. So, I guess it depends on what else is in it, right? Because if you're looking at a dehydrated vegetable, there's no reason to think that it's less healthy. But if it's maybe roasted in some extra oil and then coated in salt, there could be some other ingredients that are added to make it a little bit less healthy. And then in terms of dried fruits, these can be, ooh, wow. Ooh, dried fruit. Okay. Dried fruit
No one
can
moved.
dried fruit can be a healthy food as well. The only thing to remember is that because they are dehydrated, they're more concentrated in their sugar, right? So whereas a serving of an apple would be, sort of like the size of a baseball, a serving of dried fruit would be maybe 3 or 4 prunes or something. So the serving size is just a lot smaller because the sugar is concentrated.
Okay. Is dairy not as important to consume in adulthood compared to in childhood?
I don't think I can choose. I'm going to answer this question in the context of calcium because I think that's really what dairy is known for. It's not necessarily to say that you have to have dairy foods, but oftentimes we are trying to consume these dairy foods because of their high calcium property. Calcium is important for adults and children. Very important in children, of course. They're growing and developing, and we know peak bone mass hits at around the age of your late 20s or 30s. So after a certain age, we stop building more bone, we stop growing, right? That's why our height sort of stays the same after a while. And in adulthood as well, there are many people who actually don't get enough calcium. And so in particular, if you're not getting enough through your food or drink, or even if you have some, right, it could be from supplement as well if you're not getting enough through that way. But also consider that in adulthood, then we might be also looking at our falls risk and bone density. Thank you, our bone density as well. And so I want to say it's important in both childhood and adulthood. Is that a cop-out for an answer? That's my answer. What do you think? It's all important.
Okay, how often should we eat? How many meals a day?
That's really interesting because we did talk a bit about intermittent fasting and there was no necessarily superiority to that method. And we think, you want to regulate your food throughout the day. I mean, you have a long day ahead of you. You want a bit of food in each time of your day, whether, whenever you start your day, there can be some food at the beginning of the day, the middle of the day, the end of the day. And that can help with good, healthy metabolism, good digestion of food, helps you get the energy that you need in your day, and also helps you to create a variety of foods in your diet to meet your nutritional needs. So it is, good. And also when we're thinking about what Annie was saying, the feeling of fullness, like we don't want to have it so that all the food's coming at one time and we're feeling overstuffed. We are trying to be gentle on our digestion and kind of be mindful of our eating. So I think a combination of all those reasons would be partly the reason to spread your food out over your day.
Okay. How long can you keep cooked food in the fridge?
It depends on the food.
I know that was a bit of a loaded question.
So we like to say sort of whole grains can be kept in the fridge. Is it 3 to 4 days? Fresh fish, 2 days. Meat, fish, poultry.
If it's
If it's leftovers, it will last. Yeah. Fruits and vegetables, they can keep for quite a while.
But if
It
it were
really
cooked
depends.
food, yeah, like I think if it's cooked and it's leftovers, you do want to consume with them within 3 days, like 3 to 4 days. But again, you have to use your senses. Like you'll have to look at the food as well. Is there any mold forming? What's the smell like? Does it look a little slimy? Like you have to really kind of get in there and take a good look because you really don't want to take a chance with your food either. Like you don't want to be having something that potentially, could really throw your system off. If you're eating this and it's upsetting your digestion, I mean, you can get quite sick. And you know, food safety is really, 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 really important, and can end you up in the hospital if you're not paying attention. So we're really, really careful, and especially if the food isn't cooked, we're very careful with how long you would leave it in the fridge before cooking, and not to extend those dates.
I believe if you go online, there's lots of sort of charts and things that go through different food groups and how long they will keep raw or cooked food is recommended.
And then just to piggyback on that, can reheating cooked food increase toxins in the food?
I don't know if there are particular toxins or if this is related to certain food. In general, when we're reheating food, a good rule of thumb is to reheat it thoroughly. You might use a thermometer, or if you're reheating with a microwave, you do want to heat it hot enough that you're seeing steam come out of your food for a few minutes. So the best thing to do is make sure you're reheating your food thoroughly. I'm not sure what this question is referring to, if there's something more specific that we might be able to answer. But in general, it's okay to eat leftovers. And actually a good idea if you're doing some more cooking from home, a good idea to do that batch cooking and that meal preparation. I often encourage it.
Okay. So we're just going to pause the Q&A for a second. It appears that someone has lost a pair of glasses. So I would just ask if everyone can just take a quick peek around and just see if there are any glasses lying around or forgotten behind. I would be completely lost without mine, so thank you for everyone taking a look. Okay, thank you everybody. All right, so we just have a few questions left. And there were just a few questions surrounding fish oils and looking at consumption of fish versus fish oils, like a supplemental pill or liquid.
Fish is fantastic. Fish is a very healthy food. You can see that it's a source of protein, a source of healthy anti-inflammatory omega-3 fatty acids. You'll notice that in Jill's presentation of the Mediterranean diet, where they showed significant heart health benefits, fish is a significant part of the Mediterranean diet. So overall, fish is a fantastic way to get your omega-3 fatty acids. It's probably your best way. You're going to find it in the highest concentration in fish compared to trying to get enough from plant sources like nuts and seeds. In terms of supplementation, some people consider taking an omega-3 supplement for heart health. This is something that's come out with the American Heart Association. However, there's also been a really good high quality study from the Cochrane Reviews, and if you're familiar with the Cochrane Reviews, you'll know that they really look at a multitude of studies and only the best quality studies. And unfortunately, in the Cochrane Reviews, they have not seen a relationship between people who take omega-3 supplements and a reduction of cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes and such. So, it's healthy. We don't believe it to be harmful if you choose to take a supplement. However, we don't have solid evidence to say that it's going to reduce your chances of having a cardiovascular event. Aside from supplements, though, fish is great, 2 times a week.
Yeah. All right. Since you're recommending number per week, do you have recommendations on number of eggs per week? And are omega-3 eggs better than regular eggs?
I'll piggyback on the omega-3 part of it, because when I'm talking about a serving of fish, so a high-fat fish like salmon, mackerel, blending it together, trout, that's not a GMO fish, by the way. These sort of fish, you know, a palm size portion, you're getting thousands of milligrams, right? 1, 2, 3,000 milligrams of your omega-3 fatty acids. When you're looking at an egg that's considered a omega-3 egg, you're getting, you know, in the realm of hundreds, right? Maybe 100-200 milligrams. So you're not really getting the best bang for your buck if you're looking for something that's high in omega-3 fats. There's another part of that question.
How many?
Number of eggs.
Yeah, number of eggs per week.
Oh.
Is there a guideline?
Did I commit to this very controversial question? So the answer is no, there's no guideline in terms of number of eggs per week. In fact, you'll notice in Canada's food guide, and not too long ago, the US dietary guidelines have removed cholesterol from their recommendation. The reason is because, in fact, not a lot of foods are high in cholesterol. Egg yolks, organ meats, shellfish, sort of. That's sort of it, right? A lot of our foods aren't actually high in dietary cholesterol. So the idea is if we're eating generally lots of whole, minimally processed foods, chances are you're not going to have a high cholesterol diet. There's also been very mixed evidence and not really good studies that show that intake of egg yolk directly relates to your cholesterol levels. So that means that just because you're eating cholesterol doesn't mean that your blood has more cholesterol. It doesn't actually translate directly like that. And knowing that eggs are so nutritious for so many other reasons, we don't want to restrict egg intake so much. So in general, I would say if you have an elevated risk for heart disease, if you have high cholesterol or you're trying to lower your cholesterol, you might think about maybe 2-3 egg yolks a week. If you're not concerned about your cholesterol, then enjoy eggs as often as you like.
Just to add to that, it's also about the amount of saturated fat that's really the significant factor in the diet. So depending on how much saturated fat one's taking in relation to sort of animal proteins and fats, that may play a role as well.
So egg is a source of saturated fat. So that's one of the reasons why that also does sort of have a guideline in the case where you're at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And sometimes eggs go really nice with cheese and butter and and all the other fun things that have high saturated fat. So you're still looking at it a little bit in special populations to watch how much egg you're having, but in general populations, probably not so much so.
Okay, thank you. You have thoughts on the use of apple cider vinegar for weight loss?
No, I was just going to say, I believe that the idea is that it relates to the pH. Yeah. Is it? And the acidity within the digestive tract, but I'm not familiar with any research to support the health benefits of including it.
I want to relate this to your presentation, Jill. Jill talked about diets in the headline, and very often when we read about these sort of nutrition myths, there is a sliver, a little thread of truth somewhere, which makes it all the more believable, right? So the idea behind apple cider vinegar is that it's a vinegar, maybe the lower pH does something with our pH levels. We also know that acidity can reduce it can reduce how quickly foods turn into sugar in the bloodstream. But the idea of having apple cider vinegar as a way to lose weight or a way to reduce your blood sugars doesn't translate to real life. So when we look at people who do this, we don't really see a benefit from, we don't really see what we call a clinically significant benefit. And that means that there's no noticeable change in your body. So what you notice in your body when you draw blood with your doctor, we're not thinking that you're going to see a change, a noticeable change from apple cider vinegar. So this falls into the category of what is not harmful, but also probably not helpful. So if you like it, if you want to, that's fine. We don't think that it's going to harm you, but we also want to make sure that we're informed of what we're doing and we recognize that it might not help us either.
It just goes back to those healthy eating behaviors and making change to your to promote healthy lifestyle behaviors and healthy food choices in the right amounts spread out over the day.
Okay, if someone is gluten intolerant or not celiac, is there a nutritional deficiency if you avoid gluten? So by avoiding gluten, could you have a nutritional deficiency as a result?
Yeah, I think like if you're thinking of foods that have gluten in it, typically those will be your grain products for the most part. And foods that don't have gluten in it would be more potato and corn and rice. So the nutrients that you would be, in fact, I don't think there would be that many nutrients that would be so different from taking a diet that's much lower in gluten. For those that have celiac, we're not recommending any changes to their vitamin mineral supplementation necessarily. So I can't see why there would be any nutritional deficiency.
I think that depends on what you choose in place of your wheat, barley, and rye. So if you're substituting your whole grains with other whole grains like quinoa and potato, corn, beans, right, you could be doing very well nutritionally. If you're substituting if you're substituting these foods with potato chips or gluten-free, gluten-free cakes, gluten-free crackers, gluten-free this and that, you might be at risk of missing out on some of these important nutrients. And aside from some of those vitamins and minerals that we're talking about, fiber, a lot of times gluten-free products are lower in fiber because they don't have that whole grain aspect of it. So you can be very healthy on a gluten-free diet, but I think it's what you choose to replace your other foods with.
Remember, fruits and vegetables are gluten-free.
Okay. All right. And then lastly, there's a question surrounding balancing healthy eating and indulging. So are there recommendations on how often and what your thoughts are about that?
I think I best like the 80-20 rule. Food is fun. Like, we love food. Everyone loves foods. There's so many different fun foods for us to have. And we're not up here saying that you have to avoid processed foods completely, just not have them so regularly in your diet. So we'd be really, really thrilled if people were eating the balanced approach 80% of the time would be even outstanding, and 20% of the time for some fun here and there. I think we need flexibility in our food. I don't think it's a black and white. I think, everyone here loves food and enjoys food, wants times when they can celebrate with food. So I think we need to reflect on that, and sometimes still having some is okay.
It's also not just about the indulgence, but what is the portion of that indulgence? An indulgence can be, a nice piece of cake, an indulgence, and that could be once every couple of weeks. An indulgence could be a big piece of cake today, a cookie tomorrow, some chips the next day, a burger and fries. And so it becomes not just about that one particular, but as Marcia said, really thinking about what are you eating, how much are you having, and when and how often are you having it?
Thank you. All right, well, that's the conclusion of our question and answer session. I just want to thank Marcia, Jill, and Annie for their wonderful presentations and thorough responses to those questions. They will be available for a few minutes, so if there are any other questions at the end, you're welcome to come up and have a quick chat. But before we let you go, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. So if you drove this evening, you may have noticed that the parking pass looks different than it has in the past. So rest assured, you don't have to pay for parking. The only change is that there's no longer an attendant at the gate. So you just have to take that pass that you received to an automated pay station in M-Wing in the main entrance and just follow the instructions on the bottom of that card to get your parking compensated. We also want to remind you of our weekly Sunnybrook blog called the Personal Health Navigator. So it's written by former journalist Paul Taylor, and it's published on the Sunnybrook site once a week. And it really just provides advice to patients about the hospital and their healthcare, and it relies heavily on medical and health experts. And you can send your questions to this email address right here. So it's askpaul@sunnybrook.ca. Please be sure to hand in your evaluation forms on your way out. I see there's some people, some volunteers standing by the door, so they'll collect those on your way out. And please visit the Sunnybrook website, so www.sunnybrook.ca for updates. So we are working on finalizing our fall lineup right now. So check back in a few weeks and we should have that organized. So please check there. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. We hope you have a wonderful summer and hope to see you all in the fall.